Bonsoir et bien.
Good evening and welcome to this crash conference. Just like with any other public events, it's a bit special the way we had to organize this. There is very little audience, and most of you are watching via the web. I'd like to let you know that we comply with all the social, physical distancing. And if we're not wearing a face mask, it's not to protest at all against the wearing of a mask, but it's because we're speaking into a microphone, and also we have enough of a physical distancing to be able to do without wearing a mask. We're not protesting at all against that. This conference is entitled Clinical Trials Between Science and Financial and Academic Interests, because indeed financial interests are not the only one that come into play when talking of clinical trials. The starting point was what we call the Lancetgate. You may remember last May, the Lancet published a paper derived from an American study about the lack of efficiency of hydroxychloroquine, even though the findings of the paper were right, because indeed we demonstrated that there is no value in using hydroxychloroquine. However, the method used to reach that result was more than dubious. I remind you, this paper was published in the Lancet, and we know what happened after that. The paper was deleted from the site, and that gave rise to what was called the Lancetgate, since one of the most prestigious medical journal was being challenged and questioned because they hadn't done their checking properly. But if it was only that, it wouldn't be that interesting. There were some 47,000 so-called scientific papers in 3 months' time. And of course, for that amount of papers, you didn't have the number of serious reviewers that would have been required to verify the quality, the scientific quality of a paper. So given all that, it comes as no surprise that just anything could be published, and this paper was particularly bad, and they had vested interests as well. But this leads us to ask very serious questions, to ask questions about, like, 2 papers were published. One was an editorial in Close Medicine, published in 2009. They asserted that pharmaceutical companies were now controlling the whole value chain of the medicines, since the testing clinical trials, controlling the randomized clinical trials, all the way to the drafting the reports, the results of the study, with scientists hired by the companies, scientific drafters who were actually anonymous, because now the papers are signed by academic doctors, and their academic status is supposed to guarantee the quality of the paper, even though they had nothing to do with the study in question, nor in the drafting of the report about that study. So it was a long, detailed paper about those randomized clinical trials. But maybe Pierre has another take on that. But, it didn't create a buzz, really, surprisingly. Because myself, even though I'm, on the lookout for papers about that, I heard about it very later. And then the British Medical Journal, again in 2009, that was a key year to criticize pharmaceutical firms, apparently. They showed the importance of conflicts of interest within WHO, and that in all spheres of the organization. Concerning the response of WHO to the H1N1 pandemic in 2009, particularly concerning the benefit of Tamiflu and the vaccine Tamiflu. It was the pharmaceutical firm making it that did the assessment and evaluation and said it was good. And the British Medical Journal, after long investigation carried out by 3 journalists, very few journals can afford such a long-haul investigation, well, they concluded there were definitely lots of conflicts of interest in all the commissions and committees of the WHO and of the European Union. Those boards that decided it was urgent to vaccinate everyone and to prescribe Tamiflu, even though the BMG published another paper at the same time demonstrating that Tamiflu was of no use against H1N1, just like hydroxychloroquine serves no purpose against COVID-19. So against that background, we would like to, as a medical organization, to address those issues because we're on the lookout for therapeutic innovations that could be so useful. So we are primarily interested in the issue of the efficacy and side effects of medicines, efficacy and side effects, which reality becomes questionable because of the heavy influence of pharmaceutical firms that evaluate their own production themselves. So we turn to Pierre Chirac to address this topic. Many of us at MSF have known Pierre Chirac for a long time. He was a key stakeholder in the Access campaign, the CAM. He's acted as an advisor to the Access campaign. He's a pharmacist, a pharmacologist, and he is chief editor of Prescrire. The journal Prescrire has been for several years. I had written, he was the head of publishing. Yes, he is, but he's also the main editor. So he's a big man. He knows all that in and out. For those who don't know, Prescrire, the journal Prescrire, is the only journal for therapeutic evaluation that is totally independent from any private funding or public funding. They don't get any advertising, no subsidies, and no money from pharmaceutical firms or anything else. It's only upon subscription. So I'd like to ask a first question to Pierre Chirac, a broad question to begin with. How much credit can we lend to today's clinical trials, therapeutic trials, knowing it's an evaluation methodology that's supposed to be totally objective, extremely scientific by nature and not subjective? So we'd like to hear about how this credibility is fluctuating, maybe, because apparently the problems that we're talking about today were not always there, and they come hand in hand with deep changes in the pharmaceutical industry. We'd like to hear your take on that. So we agreed that Pierre would speak for about 30 minutes. I might interrupt him if I'd like him to clarify a point, and then we'll open the floor. You can all ask questions, those of you physically present, but also via the chat or Vimeo application for those following us via the streaming facility. Thank you, Rony. Yes, I'm really happy to be here with you at MSF. I know lots of faces. I have lots of friends at MSF. It was a highlight in my professional life and in my life to work with the Access campaign. It made sense. It was very interesting. I had to stop because I ran out of time. I was doing other things. Well, I'm not a pharmacologist. There are 100 of us, pharmacists and doctors, but I'm not a pharmacologist, and they don't train pharmacologists anymore in France. I'm just a pharmacist. This is a negative trait of France and the way we teach medicine nowadays. There are domains where we're very good, but when it comes to medicines, we're pretty bad, I must say, and we're proving it amply. Lately we have, sadly. You see what I mean? So how much credit can we grant to clinical trials? Yes, it is a key question. In order to try and answer, I'll have to say different things before that. Several points. Many of you did have questions already about the published clinical trial results. What's more difficult to grasp is this mass phenomenon. You talked about those papers published in 2009 saying all of the clinical trials should be challenged because structurally they are problematic. So that's what we shall discuss and see what we can do about it. Now, about your question, was there ever a golden age of clinical trials, perfect everything? I don't think so. I don't believe so. I'm not sure it was much better in the past for clinical trials, but today it is bad. The situation with clinical trials is definitely not satisfactory. Now, let me tell you first that there are many clinical trials that do not concern medicines, drugs, you know. You think drugs when you hear a clinical trial, but this is part of what has changed dramatically. Medicines are more and more on the forefront in responding for healthcare problems. And drug clinical trials take more and more room, if you will, in the system. But in France, half of the clinical trials carried out in France every year are sponsored by hospitals and not by private pharmaceutical firms. And a good part of those are not even trials on medicines or drugs, but on other types of healthcare, or even something totally different, like diagnosis, or just for the sake of getting to know more about the patients in order to know more about diseases. That's why, we need to make observations based on different methods. And then there are interventional studies. Some interventions can be carried out. So clinical trials. At Prescrire, we call that observational studies, and then interventional trials. We use the word trials only when it's interventional to underscore the fact that it's basically experimental. Rony Brauman. Those are the controlled randomized trials. Yes, controlled randomized controlled trials, RCTs, are one category of interventional trials. It's the best for us because it gets rid of all the potential bias, or most of the potential bias, when it comes to evaluating the efficacy of an intervention within a population. If you want to get rid of the main biases, like maybe the disease will treat itself on its own in 3 days, that's one bias we have to take it into account. Another bias is that you may have different types of population, even if you carry out a comparative trial, if you have two drastically different groups. If you give chloroquine to young patients, for example, and in the other group you have elderly patients, it's a major bias, right? So it's difficult to come to any conclusion about the efficacy of chloroquine. That's why we randomize, we have a control group, and to get rid of the placebo effect, it's a double-blind study, meaning that neither the patient or the doctors know what the patient took really. So this method, double-blind, randomized controlled trials, is the gold standard. It's the gold standard because that's only on that basis that you can identify a causal link between a given intervention and what's happening. Of course, clinical trials developed mostly after World War II, but already back in 1865, Claude Bernard, in his Introduction to Experimental Medicine treaty, he was explaining why it was necessary to conduct comparative trials. He simply stated, often doctors boast about treating all their patients with a particular remedy they used. The first question to put to them is, have you tried doing nothing? That is, not treating any other patients. Otherwise, how to know whether it's the remedy or nature alone that cured them? So in 2020, you see, we have a great world wide-known doctors who should understand that, but they don't apply that principle. So in many countries, you have lots of professors, lots of caregivers, and lots of patients who have not taken on, integrated that basic notion, really, which makes it difficult to make a proper evaluation. You know, it doesn't take just observing what's happening after administering a drug to a patient to decide it's working or not. It's a bit more complicated. Hence, the need to establish a causal link. And due to that, the trials may become more and more sophisticated because you have to specify under what conditions a clinical trial can really bring some knowledge, evidence-based knowledge. Robust evidence is what's needed. That's why we have those randomized, double-blind with placebo trials. But some of the trials do not have those characteristics, and it's more or less problematic to determine the exact cause. Sometimes the causal link is more difficult to establish, and when you have a disease that is lethal very quickly in 100% of the patients, it doesn't take a very complex trial to show what works or not. You have to take all that on board, of course. Now, so those RCTs, randomized controlled trials, can apply to other types of intervention, like you can do surgery with a phantom, a sham surgery, Nobel prizes, studying energy fluxes, for example. I mean, they would make comparative trials as well. So comparative trials apply to other scientific domains, even in economics. Now, about the pharmaceutical firms' trials. At the time when we set up the drug agencies and new regulations for marketing drugs, that was back in the 30s, 1930s in the US and in the 1960s in Europe, firms were required to provide a dossier providing the evidence of the efficacy and safety of their products. And at the time, the firms didn't like it at all. They hated the idea of being required to conduct clinical trials. They liked it better before when it was quicker and cheaper for them to market drugs. But we had big health disasters. Thalidomide in Europe. In the US, it was a kind of syrup or where a compound, well, there had been a mistake in the excipient. It was a major health disaster. It killed many people. Thalidomide led to lots of fetus malformation. So the public authorities demanded that from now on, the firms should carry out clinical trials. And it was a real plus. It was good. because then the method and, well, everything became more robust. Now, as time went, of course, the pharmaceutical firms did all they could to gain control over the process. You can say that from the moment company or the public authorities demanded from a private operator to provide all the evidence to gain access to the market, of course, obviously, you're taking a risk as the public authority. So you have to set up a whole safeguard system to make sure that everything is okay and robust and supported by evidence. However, when you look at what the public authorities did, public policies, starting in the 60s, the drug agencies were really demanding, like the FDA in the US would demand 2 different trials to prove the efficacy of a drug. Throughout the 90s and 2000s, some exemptions were brought to that rule, however. And today, the exception is not that they would have less than 2 trials, it's that they would have 2 different trials. More and more drugs are marketed, put on the market on the basis of 1 single trial. When you look at what the firms are saying, their official rationale is, okay, prior to marketing a drug, we have to go through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials. But in practice, more and more drugs are marketed after only phase 2 trials, and sometimes even just on the basis of early phase 2 trials, meaning that you would have application files containing very flimsy evidence at too early a stage of administering the drugs to patients, and how can you conclude anything on that basis? And that's because the pharmaceutical firms wanted it like that, and also the public policies did not go for more control. They let it go. And there was this little war between the US and Europe, one trying to have clinical trials on its soil, on its territory. I'm not into the plot theory. I'm not saying the firms or drug agencies organized all that to do it at the detriment of the patients. Of course, it's not their purpose, but there are reasons that are such that due to the competition between the US and Europe, the level of demand of the drug agencies gets lower and lower. They are less demanding. And of course, the obvious interest of pharmaceutical firms is to market their products as early as possible, so their products stay on the market for as long as possible with the protection of the patents. So I think it's the public authorities that are responsible for that deterioration. They lowered the level of demand they had towards pharmaceutical firms, and the latter became expert at carrying out just minimum clinical trials just to get the marketing authorization. If you look at Sofosbuvir by Gilead, it was a great breakthrough against hepatitis C, no doubt. But when you look at the clinical trials they supplied to get the market authorization, it was a minimum level, the cheapest clinical trial possible, and it doesn't prove much in itself, by the way.
No, they could have carried out a much larger trial that would have been more conclusive and more convincing, but they really complied with the minimum requirement, and really it is on the verge of what is statistically significant, so as to spend as little money as possible. Now, I just want to say a few words about Sofosbuvir, because I'm quite amazed at what you are saying, what you are telling us, because I'm no specialist, but I was given to think that the efficacy is almost 100%. So it's amazing to learn that the results were not that convincing. And is it Gilead that was responsible for development? No, they were not responsible for development, but it's a small company called Pharmacist that came up with the drug. However, says Rony, because they had such a good molecule, a good chemical entity, why didn't they go for a trial that would have been more convincing? And because they trusted the drug, obviously. Yes, indeed, you're right. And there are other elements of evidence that can show that it's a real breakthrough for hepatitis C patients. However, even if they had in their hands the possibility to organize a trial that would have been more, that would have been much more beautiful and much more elegant, well, they didn't go for it because they just wanted to save money. And this is why they want to enroll as few patients as possible in their trials. Now, at one point in time, the drug agencies required a comparison, not versus placebo, but versus the reference treatment. So they raised the level of requirements, but they did everything possible as to avoid the non-inferiority. Usually, non-inferiority trials are used in the wrong way. They are misused, that is, and more particularly if there are a few differences between the drugs, and you end up with the outcomes that are not really giving you any certainty. So a number of these methodological innovations or inventions, as you may call it, mean that the trials that are funded by the pharmaceutical industry are really subject to a lot of uncertainties and bias. And you really need to drill down if you want to understand this, because there are many loopholes, and the methodology is usually very complex, and it makes it very difficult for you to understand what goes on. However, the pharmaceutical companies are not the only ones that introduce this sort of biases in clinical trials. As publicly funded clinical trials present with more or less the same sort of flaws. This is why you need to keep a critical eye. This is the most important thing. You need to look at these trials. For instance, the HCQ, hydroxychloroquine in mouse cells. No pharmaceutical company would dare organize such a trial. It's unbelievable. This is so amateurish. You don't know whether this is willingly, deliberately, poorly done, or whether it is meant to be that way. And these trials were not, the outcomes were not really published as such. They were just posted on the web, and methodology experts could list the long list of flaws and of errors that had been that were associated with these trials of HCQ. Now, gradually over the years, things have improved, and some measures have been taken so as to curb down the flows of these international trials with registries, whereby the companies had to publish their trial protocols before actually starting the trial. It's a way to make sure that the company then once the results and the outcomes are published, you can then check and compare this with the protocol. For instance, let me give you an example of something that really drifted away. Like you take the primary endpoint for an RCT, and you've got secondary endpoints, but in the article that is published, they focus only on secondary endpoints. And if you are not an expert, or if you are not too demanding, in fact, you just miss it completely. And all the more so because originally the protocol didn't include the or didn't focus on the secondary endpoints, whereas now, because you know about the protocol that is due to take place, you can identify this sort of manipulations. To make a comparison with what you just said and the trial conducted for HCQ, for hydroxychloroquine, and the other trials carried out by the pharmaceutical industry, you are telling us that these people are judge and party, whether they are private or public. There is this original bias because they are, of course, they've got a vested interest in the outcome of the trial. And irrespective of the precautions taken, if you just leave the pharmaceutical industry a free rein to do whatever they please, like for instance vaccination, the overall budget is 10 billion euros. Of course, 10 billion euros split across 5 companies with this new vaccine. And it's a lot of money, and one would kill for far less than $10 billion. And you were referring to the fact that the public authorities or the publicly funded trials wouldn't be a solution or wouldn't solve all problems. Yes, of course, you're right, because the confirmation bias would be built in as well. Of course, if you are, if the same people that came up with the chemical entity also conduct the trials, well, of course, there is indeed a bias. Though one must say that the most poorly done registries are the registries presented by French public health organizations. It's one of the flaws of the French research. But you have to remember that it's either you publish or you perish. And it's true that for academics in French hospitals, it means publishing or not being promoted. So, of course, the longer the list of papers, of articles you've been able to publish, well, the higher up you'll go. And it's also a way to get a budget, to get access to public money, to public funds. And one knows that Professor Raoult's team is benefited greatly from that, because all these publications have meant that his institute got 11 million euros for the organization, his institute in Marseille, which is a public institute. It's a public body. Now, a lot of Professor Raoult's publications are not in first-rate journals. However, they do bring in some cash. They are fraught with errors and mistakes, these papers, these articles. There was there is an article, a paper published in the newspaper Libération a few weeks ago, signed by academics saying, well, it's totally rubbish to give money to these academics on the basis of the number of articles they've been able to publish, because there's no control whatsoever. So in line with what you were saying, Rony, in order to make sure that either the academics, the hospital researchers, or the pharmaceutical firms do not tweak their studies, their trials, you can rely on registries. And furthermore, you know that in an article, everything is made very concise. For instance, you may see that 10% of these patients presented with that effect or this one. But what you can do is to drill down and check more precisely. And this is what you can do. And this is, for instance, for paroxetine, it is possible to see that Glaxo had concealed that paroxetine increased the risk of committing suicide in teenagers, because the coding of the outcomes concealed this. With Surgisphere, it's exactly what was highlighted. Surgisphere. We don't know whether this trial is fake or not. There are some mistakes. And this is how some people reading the Lancet identify the problem. Like you had two groups of Australian patients, but it was the same group. The number of patients in Africa was totally impossible, and I think that this is it is so obvious that these people, Surgisphere, were caught red-handed. However, it also showed that the academics, the hospital professors, had also signed this article without checking. So the Lancet turned to the authors and asked them to take a look at the data more thoroughly, but the authors didn't get access to the data because Surgisphere couldn't disclose the data. So you see, it means that there are also some articles that are signed by prominent professors who haven't really read the article at all and who haven't seen the data. Multiple center trials are also a big problem because, with the exception of the sponsor, none of the investigators has read through the whole data. So the Lancet, and it's something that they should be credited of having done. They are now going to demand authors to disclose the origin of their data.
Donc ça, c'est vraiment quelque chose de très important. C'est que petit à petit, face à ces biais et dérives.
And so you see, following this series of trials that were not up to the mark, more requirements are imposed on authors. But we could also have a new deal with a radical change in the system. This is what Richard Smith is suggesting. He was one of the chief editors of BMJ. He wrote a book in 2005, and it's, you see, and he argued in the book that the pharmaceutical industry just gets the outcome that it's looking for. And that some journals are just a proxy of the pharmaceutical industry. And he suggests in the book to to take clinical research out of the hands of the pharmaceutical industry, not to give it to hospital professors, but to be entrusted to the scientific community, being open on the web to identify the top priority for any given pathology, so that scientists and academics can contribute to the design of a trial, like Sofosbuvir. You could think that if we had another system, the public authorities could say, well, for hepatitis C, these are the things we want to, these are the questions we'd like you to answer for this drug to be marketed, to be licensed. And then you could have a pool of scientists designing the RCT. You could have the protocol open, out in the open on the web. Then you could have another set of people in charge of conducting the investigation on the drug, and that yet another set of people to interpret the outcome, and yet another set of people responsible for publication. Because, of course, otherwise everyone has got a vested interest in having positive outcome. So you need to eliminate this vested interest from people who, of course, have, would be very too much prone in finding positive outcome because it serves their purpose. And it would rule out all the biases that are just everywhere in clinical research. Now, I don't know whether you have talked too much already or too long. François Bompard, DNDi. What you said about the databases that contain the protocols and that are online is very interesting. Don't you think it would be it could be interesting to send to your reviewers not only the article itself but also the protocol? Don't you think it could be a way to eliminate some of the biases you mentioned? Yes, of course. Now, I can understand that people are disappointed in the Lancet, but take Wakefield study in 1998, proving the link between MMR vaccine and autism. Was already a big phony trial or study because it is all the patients in this study were invented, were fake. It is a massive fraud. So, and it took 12 years for the Lancet to withdraw this study, but you can still listen to Wakefield. Is still holding conferences, and it contributes, it fuels the anti-vax campaign. There are lots of people who don't get their children vaccinated against MMR because of Wakefield. How can you imagine that a reviewer didn't see that it is a fraud, it is a fake? These fraudsters are very good. They are very clever. So I don't think you can rule this out completely. However, some reviewers are more or less take their job more or less seriously. The Lancet has got 2 reviewers, which is a very good thing because not all journals have 2 reviewers. And take COVID-19, you've got a wealth of articles published everywhere, including online. So maybe, of course, sending the protocol could help. Maybe some journals already require the protocol. And the Lancet, let me tell you, isn't the worst. Maybe it's unfair on the Lancet, by the way. But the editor-in-chief, Richard Anton, reacted adequately, in my view, and corrected the error. Julien Potré, CAM. I just want to qualify the Surgisphere. It is a retrospective study, you see. It is big data. Yes, it's big data. So masses of data from which you can read a signal. However, this data was collected in a fairly opaque way. But I think it's different from the biases you see in clinical trials. The Surgisphere, it's a new model. It's big data. It's not very clear what you can do with it. So I think it's something which is quite specific, and you can't really extrapolate to other clinical trials that have very different methodology. Yes, indeed, you're right. And it's one of the things that is interesting with Surgisphere, because it's highlighted the big problem with big data. People are quite in awe of big data and are fascinated by this. And even the EMEA and the FDA, they think that they are going to be able to lighten the burden of RCTs before licensing, because they'll be able to collect the data afterwards, and particularly thanks to big data, and looking at what goes on in the population. But I think this big near miss in the Lancet highlighted the problem with big data altogether. And maybe some of the decision makers, politicians came to realize, or managers of directors of public bodies came to realize that big data can't help you to solve everything. Lise Marnu, I'm a journalist, a scientific journalist. Here's my question with regard to the protocols of phase 2 and phase 3 recently published about the COVID vaccine by some pharmaceutical companies. Did you take a look at them? Do you think it's in line with the efficacy requirements and public health requirements? And about Richard Smith and what he suggests in his book. Maybe it's what was and contemplated with the solidarity vaccine scheme, but it seems to me that it's not really started, or it's not really fruitful so far. I'm very sorry because I forgot your first question. The protocols. Did you take a look at them? No, I didn't, but some other people did, and they could identify the lack of elderly people for Moderna and Pfizer. They have 40,000 people, and they've got 30,000 people, Moderna, but no elderly. And it's a bit too bad, because the main victims of COVID are elderly people. Yes, but these trials are based on volunteers. Is it because they don't get, or elderly patients do not want to volunteer? I don't know, but it's one of the limitations of the trial, because the vaccine is going to be, or may be effective in young, healthy individuals. So it's going to be one of the limitations of this trial. If you imagine that things had been specified more collectively and more clearly, if we had all of us put our heads together to identify the priorities of a new vaccine against COVID-19, then obviously collectively it would have been decided to have a lot of elderly patients, because they are the ones who are the most at risk. Solidarity is a very interesting approach. It's a large adaptative trial or recovery or discovery. It's interesting. It's much more interesting than what you see in the US, in Spain or in France with tens or dozens of trials that don't go to prove anything at all because they are too small. The UK started a bit later, however, they started with one, they just did one test recovery, one trial recovery, but they're much better than we are in terms of drugs and trials. And you see, France decided to have one trial, discovery. They wanted to work with foreign researchers, but it didn't work out. And also, it's interesting because when it's adaptative, you can start an arm and then close it if need be, and you can't imagine a pharmaceutical company doing so. However, it's something which was carried out in a very specific period with already existing drugs. So you can't really extend it more broadly. However, it's much better than what was done in France with dozens of trials that didn't prove anything at all.
Je préempte, pardon, juste parce que c'est sur le même sujet, donc je voudrais entendre Pierre éventuellement répondre.
I've got another question on the same subject as Rony. I think there are 300 candidate vaccines, if I'm not mistaken, though it's quite, mind-boggling, as it were. Do you think it's possible to test out all these vaccines? How could you possibly organize trials for all these vaccines? How are you going to practically test these vaccines, or how are they going to go through all the hurdles needed? Well, not all 300 are going to be marketed. Let's take the dozens of trials on HCQ, an existing drug. There's nothing in the French system that could prevent people, each hospital carrying out its own trial. Because there is no authority whatsoever in France that would force hospital representatives to work together. And that's only for a drug that is already in existence. So can you imagine what is going to happen for vaccines that are totally new? There's no level of control whatsoever. Everybody's just waiting for the vaccine, and people are very happy to see that there's a lot of competition and there are 300 candidates. And everybody hopes that there's going to be some that will make it. However, all these vaccines are going to be able to enroll patients for the first phases, of course, but maybe not afterwards. And also, there's one thing you need to bear in mind. You've got this totally madman, Trump, who'd like to get just anything out there on the market. And of course, the pharmaceutical industry is very cautious, is very wary of marketing a vaccine that isn't fully tested. Then you've got Putin, who is arguing along another line. So I think that pharmaceutical companies may have an interest in standing out from the crowds and saying, mine is better because it's fully tested. Just to stand out from, the startup companies that are just embarking on or jumping on the bandwagon to produce a vaccine. And I think it's going to be pretty effective. It's going to mean that a lot of these candidate vaccines are not going to make it. There's one question from the web, Olaf asking, you to give an example of a product approved only after phase 2. And Céline, what do you think about the RSV experimental vaccination for MSF mission in DRC and this notion of being a volunteer to be vaccinated, to be immunized is quite relative considering the type of system in place?
Les médicaments.
Well, as I said earlier, there are 100 of us working at Prescrire, and some are dedicated to looking at novel drugs. Every year, there are new drugs coming on the market following a phase 2 trial, and you see more and more of those, even after the early phase 2 trials. Well, sometimes you can understand because you're talking about rare, neglected diseases or some forms of cancer. But there are many of those being marketed only only after phase 2 trials. Now, I cannot answer about the vaccine itself, but the notion of volunteers, yes, volunteers to try vaccine, it's a relative thing. It depends on the level of information you have. You have the global, the World Helsinki Declaration, which sets the ethical standards. They try to defend the patients enrolled in the trials versus the investigators, if you will, because the investigator is in a conflict of interest precisely. The best interest of the investigator is not to waste too much time trying to enroll patients. So they believe they should protect the participants from the interests of the sponsor, but also of the investigator interests. Hence, the idea of informed consent is probably a utopia, but it's a great principle. We have to get as close as we can to that. But I remember Richard Smith joking about the non-inferiority trials. He said the question we should ask to the people participating in the trials is, do you agree to participate in a clinical trial that will demonstrate and prove nothing? That would be the right question. But, yes, it's always a good idea to probe into whether the volunteers are really volunteering to try vaccines. Rony Brauman. Yeah, and the notion of informed consent, it's a value in itself also that is hard to reach. Recently, I was attending a PhD dissertation presentation. It was about a trial of a vaccine against rotavirus enteritis, and the question of the consent of the people directly involved, that is the mothers who should get in the trial to have their child vaccinated. Well, that was a very complex question, or maybe not complex, but, well, in a way, it was clear-cut. It was the interest of the mothers to have their child enrolled in the study because that would give them a possible protection, and there is health care attached to that, to participating in the trial. There is social pressure also, and also pressures due to some rumors, people rejecting vaccines. People say that vaccines sterilize the children, that they have a hidden agenda when they immunize. It's highly polarized. But at any rate, the issue of the informed consent is raised. In Niger, the trial on rotavirus was in Niger, or in a university hospital in Paris, or elsewhere in an industrialized country. The question of informed consent is always more or less fictitious because there is a total lack of symmetry and equality between the patient and the physician. And maybe it'd be a good idea at some point to hold a meeting on the ethics of informed consent, since MSF does take part in trials directly or indirectly via epicenter, or with the DNDi, we do participate in trials as well. I don't think we can solve the issue of informed consent, but at least we should try to shed more light on it and not go for a magical formula. Oh, we got the informed consent, so no more problems. Yes, there is always a problem, and we have to be aware of it, conscious of it. Also about the conflict of interest between the sponsor or promoter of a product and the one doing the evaluation. We talked about that with Bernard Pécoul, the founder and the boss of DNDi. We were talking about an evaluation that DNDi wanted to conduct in Sudan. And we had a discussion about who should conduct the trial. Should it be DNDi itself, or should it be people from MSF who would be partly foreign to DNDi? Relatively more remote or more independent. And Bernard insisted that the undisputable honesty of DNDi teams and personnel led him to think that any trial conducted by DNDi would for sure be interpreted without any bias in a perfectly earnest, honest way, which personally I didn't totally believe in. And so it gave rise to some discussion between my old friend Bernard and myself. And Pierre Chirac was reminding us that clinical trials date back to post-World War, the 50s and 60s, it's true. And until then, the evaluation of medicines was considered as just pertaining to the honesty and rigor of experimented clinicians that had a reputation of seriousness. It rested only on the supposed seriousness of a clinician. That served as an evidence. Of course, that level of evidence, rightly so, was considered later as insufficient. But it's what the situation that prevailed for a long time. I wanted to go back to the question of drugs being marketed after only a phase 2 or early phase 2 trial. We understand the level of scientific demand for clinical trials. They should be conducted as best as possible. But at the same time, you have some patients with a fatal disease and who would love to benefit from any treatment, even if it carries a risk. So is it entirely satisfying that the authorities, public authorities, would tell someone whose life is threatened to say, okay, we'll decide for you if you have the right to take a product or not? So how can we answer that? You're right. I talked of deregulation from the standpoint of the agencies, drug agencies, but they deregulate on that on behalf of patients requiring innovative diseases. Well, first, you can have some illusion about the innovative character of drugs, and it's only from a given moment that you know whether the drug is efficacious or not. The way to solve that is to carry out an evaluation that does not prevent early access, we call it for compassionate use in France for patients who have no hope. So prior to the market authorization, if you have a fatal disease without a satisfying treatment, of course, it's worth trying something else. It's worth having that possibility. But one of the prerequisites for that, or the right conditions, for those patients, even if they're outside a clinical trial proper, you have to correctly evaluate what's happening with those patients as well. In France, it took us a long time to look at those compassionate use cohorts, because for a long time we gave access to the patients to those novel drugs without rigorously studying what was happening. That was a wasted loss of knowledge, if you will. It was harmful, and we overcame that now. So, yeah, at some point you can consider giving a drug that has not been completely evaluated if the patient is at risk of dying and it's worth trying. But if you give access too early to a drug that was poorly evaluated, the risk is that that drug will never be properly evaluated, because everything that was put in place by the public authorities in terms of conditional authorization, like, okay, this drug has not been completely evaluated, but you can put it on the market provided that you give us some trials afterwards to complete the information we have so far. But in practice, the pharmaceutical firms drag their feet. They proceed as slowly as they can, maybe not on purpose, because indeed then it becomes more difficult to enroll patients in those trials. It's true. But the post-market authorization trials for compassionate use, for example, it takes much longer than planned, and the authorities are not demanding enough. You know, they just, no, they don't get an answer. It's been described, and some people have that specialty. They published that in the BMJ. We looked 5 years later, if we had gotten answers for drugs put on the market very early, 5 years after this early authorization, we still don't know. We still didn't get the supplementary information we needed, you see? So it's a balancing act between the interests of the patients and the participants. That's part of the complexity. You enroll patients in clinical trials to protect future patients. You know, in order to avoid major disasters, you test on a few patients, and the knowledge you derive will allow you to avoid any big crash or big health crisis before selling it on a big scale. That's the value of it. But when you're in the other phase, I mean, you decide to give early access to drugs that were not properly evaluated, but because patients or their life is jeopardized, they're going to die in 6 months, it's their last chance. But unfortunately, you'll continue administering that drug to patients without knowing really whether the risk-benefit analysis is in favor of the patient or not. Many drugs are marketed today against cancer, for example, and many of those anti-cancer drugs really make the last moments of life of the cancer patients totally miserable instead of helping them. And hope, you know, hope is crucial in medicine, but sometimes it has very harmful consequences as well. Rony Brauman. Before handing over to Emmanuel Baron, I'd like to add to that, isn't that the role of pharmacovigilance bodies? I mean, one of the benefits we could expect from serious pharmacovigilance is to inform us, to keep us informed about what happens after the early marketing of a drug, after only phase 2 trials. And another question, is it true that in the European framework, pharmacovigilance was placed solely in the hands of the pharmaceutical industry? That's what I heard a while ago. Is it still valid? Is it still true? Pierre Chirac. Well, yeah, you get lots of information on adverse effects after the marketing authorization from pharmacovigilance bodies, but real trials done after the marketing authorization can also give you more information. Big data as well, we don't know, but potentially, I mean, if it's robust big data, with a good analysis, it can shed more light and provide you with information. But the problem with pharmacovigilance is that the whole system is tied to reporting side effects. And caregivers, doctors primarily, would report undesirable side effects. Typically, and we know that unfortunately depends on the country. Well, actually, it's everywhere. Doctors are reluctant to report on side effects. It's not every day that a cancerologist seeing side effects in her patients would report those side effects. She might not even see those effects or not interpret them as undesirable, adverse, or side effects. The ones that are most reported on are those we're beginning to recognize as definitely being there. But before reaching the stage where you establish a link between the drug and a given side effect, it may take a long time because it's not taken into account. Look at the mediator case. Typically, it's very typical. No cardiologist was able to attribute heart valve problems to the taking of that drug. Neither did diabetologists or GPs. When they attributed it to something, it was to like acute rheumatoid arthritis. Even though we don't see many cases here in France, and all of a sudden there were 1,000 such cases. And then we heeded and we started collecting real reports on side effects, but it took a long time. Chiche in Marseille had a case of valvulopathy, but Servier, the pharmaceutical firm owner, and someone from the municipal council went to exert some pressure on that doctor to deter him from reporting the effects that were undesirable. So there was one case of valvulopathy in France, another one in Toulouse, but before the shit hit the fan, we had 2 cases only. And then we identified thousands of cases of very severe, very serious side effects. So it's very useful, pharmacovigilance, it should be done, but don't see it as a safety net. Now, in France, you have regional pharmacovigilance centers or bodies that do their job correctly. And in France, we kept an old system. The European Commission tried to decide that the firms themselves could report on side effects. But in France, we decided that the pharmacovigilance bodies, regionally or nationally, should also be in charge of reporting side effects, not leave it all to pharmaceutical firms. It's dangerous. We don't want to do that. All right, and to finish on that, before handing the floor for more questions, with the mediator case, the whistleblower, Irène Frachon, this woman pneumologist, she talked with the experts on Market Authorization Commission, and the experts on those commissions would ridicule her. And it turned out they were hired by Servier, and they criticized her. They tried to undermine her reports. And Servier, it's one of their strong points, cardiovascular drug. And they would finance all the so-called congresses, medical conventions where cardiologists and pneumologists would get together. So they were absolute kings in cardiology and pneumology. And that's why maybe it was difficult to point out at pulmonary problems. And, they have a tight control over what happens with the heart and the lungs. So, of course, other firms tried to say that Mr. Servier was sort of a sociopath, Mr. No, maybe so. But anyway, You know, those are structural flaws that we can identify in the whole pharmaceutical industry. A question from Emmanuel Baron. Please introduce yourself, Emmanuel. My name is Emmanuel Baron from Epicenter. Good evening, Pierre. Long time no see. Nice seeing you. First, in the answer you gave, I'd like to underline, you said that the risk is to come up with a poor healthcare standard or a bad one. And for people at MSF and Epicenter, it brings back bad memory, like with the Favipiravir against Ebola. The study was not done correctly. It was named a clinical trial, but they had only one arm. Favipiravir. And so they came up with a standard that did not resist the next epidemic. So, and then we were able to demonstrate there were two drugs that were more efficacious than the others, and Favipiravir failed. And it's a hydroxychloroquine, which is a health standard first-line drug in the national protocol nowadays. So, you know, it's not been evaluated for given indications, so it will remain a gold standard. But sometimes it is justified, as you reminded us of in certain situations. You have the risk-benefit analysis, one of the risks being to produce a standard that might never be challenged when it should be. Well, tonight I came with an idea in mind, a big question in mind, and I'm delighted because Rony and you, Pierre, you touched on what obsesses me in details. It's about the independence of clinical trials to evaluate a drug. And you suggested the right way to go about it, or other ways. It's true that it's fascinating to see how meticulous, how obsessive you have to be to go through all the details of a study, avoid any bias, and at the time of the final evaluation, no more scruples, no more barriers, and it's just the shopkeeper deciding, oh, my product is excellent, and I'm going to prove it to you. So the question of the transparency of information and all that, but you showed that it can be totally phony, total baloney. But now, true, there are some publications that stun you. I mean, some papers are published, you're flabbergasted, including in the best medical journals. And when you look at the conflict of interest, you know, some people are hired by a company and they dare sign a paper promoting a drug from that firm. Well, of course, a publication is not the beginning and the end of everything. They don't decide what exactly will be put on the market ultimately. But I also have in mind the way MSF views that. And I go back to what you said about Sudan and our colleagues from DNDi and their trial. My question, would you advise MSF and Epicenter to still fight on that aspect, including when talking with DNDi? Because they don't, they're not that comfortable when we want to bring that, to put it back on the table, you know? So why not? Let's go for it. Well, those are essential questions to ask ourselves. And Bernard's answer saying, well, we're honest and earnest, and so no problem. You know, everybody believes they're honest and sincere, and you know, most people believe they're honest and unbiased, and yet sometimes they goof, or they don't do the right thing, particularly when they have vested interests. So the question of, you know, being honest is not relevant, and it's not enough. We have to stick by some rules to objectively try and limitate conflicts of interest. When talking of conflicts of interest, we think doctors and pharmaceutical industry, but it's much more widespread in real life. We are having conflicts of interest all the time. So, you know, you have to find something else. It's not enough to say people tend to be honest. So maybe outsource, you know, diluting, splitting, separating might be a solution, but it's not the ultimate solution, the golden bullet. You know, even the pharmaceutical firms, they don't conduct their own clinical trials. They outsource them. And still, they have the upper hand on their subcontractors. We call them the CROs in France. They compete with each other. You know, they apply some constraints unto themselves in order to stay in the system and keep on performing. The performance criteria when it comes to clinical trial is how fast you can do it, how fast you can enroll people, participants in your clinical trials. And then comes some tension, you know, did they give enough time for people to give their informed consent or not? It's difficult in France to carry out clinical trials because many people are reluctant, it takes time, it's time consuming. So they decide to carry out clinical trials in other countries where it's easier for this or that reason, people will be less reluctant to take part in trials. So maybe the CRO method is a solution for DNDi, or maybe they should approach an MSF group having nothing to do with DNDi. But I think it is a concern, structurally speaking, it's a problem if a sponsor or promoter and DNDi do the clinical research themselves. Because, you know, any sponsor, promoter, investigator, all they want is that this drug will work. They'd love it. They believe it's great for the patients, wholeheartedly. So psychologically, your vision is kind of blurred. You know, you lose sight of this aspect, you lose sight of adverse effects because you're oriented in one direction. You want it too much. So really, side effects, you know, they're not even mentioned in clinical trials, or they're mentioned there but forgotten in another report. The meta-analysis of clinical trials with their protocols, you know, the meta-analysis of clinical trials trying to make a methodological summary synthesis on a given drug, very often amongst their criteria, you have everything dealing with efficacy. However, the mentioning of side effects, I mean, the side effects are not even mentioned in their protocol. You know, they're in the Prospero register or registry, they claim to look at side effects, and in the final report, no mention of it. So it's something that people don't like to see, don't like to look at. It's very easy to overlook side effects, not to see them as adverse effects. All the more reason to limit the bias of deciding to evaluate yourself, your own production, you know, being judge and party to it. Well, I'm sorry, because you're discussing about this controversy in Sudan, but I don't know anything about it. But I fully agree. Personally, we always have some implicit bias because the topic and the drug, the disease is dear to our heart. I admit it. And maybe we should design a system, a safeguard system, maybe not in the conducting of the drug itself. However, the design of the study, the interpreting of the data, and the publication of the data, it might be a good idea to be challenged by independent players. But I'll gather information about what happened in Sudan. It sounds interesting, and it raises a very relevant question. Yes, we all have a bias. We cannot avoid it.
Écoute, Bernard, I must say that I never said such a thing. I never told Rony what I was quoted to have said, and other comments saying that the discussion may be a bit too exaggerated. Now, Bernard, we will go on discussing at home, I'm sure, at my place, because I'm not done with you yet.
Je vais relire quelques questions qui ont été posées sur Internet.
Okay, question from the net, from Donald.
De régulation de...
What level of control and regulation should the state exert on pharmaceutical trials or on pharmaceutical firms for clinical trials? And then, Olaf, you raised a problem that can never be solved. Good clinical trials cost a lot of money, and if you want to have them done by neutral, quote-unquote, people not coming for the world of the pharmaceutical industry and promoters, where would you get the money from? Who would put the money on the table?
Alors ensuite, Geza, alors on a coutume...
Okay, more questions. Geza, we say that the patients cohort enrolled in clinical trials are not representative of the general population. In particular, there are very few women in some countries because they fear teratogenic effects and they fear their, if they're pregnant, their child might have some malformation. Is it true? So, Donald, what kind of influence could public authorities have on clinical trials? Well, it happens so that in some countries, clinical trials are subject to authorization. In France, we have a dual system. The green light should be given by the French Drug Agency. And then you also should get authorization from committees in charge, regional committees in charge of protecting people. And the European regulation on clinical trials enable those bodies to voice an opinion, a deontological opinion, ethical one, like confirming the informed consent should be given, and they also have a word to say about the design of the trials. And then we can do it. The authorities have the upper hand, because they give the green light or not, or they don't authorize a clinical trial. So it can be done in a very practical way at that moment. For Olaf tells us, yeah, good clinical trials are expensive. Sure, NIH in the US, they have $5 million for their budget in clinical trials. And they do conduct good, robust clinical trials. In France, our budget is ridiculous. It's on the rise, but it's still too small. In the UK, they do have money for clinical research.
And in any case, if you consider the system in place in France, whereby drugs are paid for by the community, well, you pay for everything. You pay for the drug itself, but you pay for the research that is needed to design the drug. So it's indeed as if we were investing. If we were spending this money to assess reliably and independently the drugs, then we would get a return on investment because we would know more about these drugs. We could be able to make robust choices. We could say, well, for this pathology, this is the first line treatment, and then the second line of treatment should be this one. Whereas with the current system, it's very difficult to give these directions, or the decision-making is not that easy. So spending money, it would be, in any case, money is spent, but it would be money well spent. And patients in clinical trials are not representative, most certainly for phase 1 and 2. And with regard to phase 3, there are lots of people who are not included, elderly people, women, children. Well, it all depends on the disease, obviously. And I may exaggerate here. But if you consider clinical trials for things that pertain to women primarily, well, these women are not included in those trials. And the majority of drugs used by women have never been assessed in women. So, you see, for female patients, it's a sort of caricature. You may feel that you have your conscience for you because the trials have been carried out, but not on them, not on women. So it may be as dangerous. There's a recent book to be taken with a pinch of salt. However, interesting in that it takes a look at what happens for women and women in clinical trials. So, well, this would be a minimum requirement for drugs that are almost exclusively administered to women, or essentially mainly administered to women, should be assessed in women. My name is Rebecca Gray, and I work with Epicentre. Coming back to two things you said right at the start. Firstly, regarding databases. Now, of course, it's very important to get access to the database and make sure that what has been published is indeed coming from the database. And there's yet another point which you didn't touch upon and which concerns transparency. It seems to me that a protocol plus the investigations, the analysis, plus SAP, plus everything is much more important than having the solely or the database solely. I'm not talking to you in particular, but I'm just talking to the audience. And you should not underestimate the people in the big pharma. What they want to do is to conduct an RCT that is as clean as possible, quote unquote, and with the lowest level of risk. And I think that the public opinion or want to see the database, but the databases may not prove so interesting because the primary endpoints may not be listed or are not listed in them. Then Olaf was saying that it's costly. And ironically, I'd say that when it comes to how much it costs, it's very difficult to not to mention the sponsors, the donors, and also the salaries to be paid to investigators, and also what you may call competitive funding, i.e. Based on the number of patients, the speed of the investigation. So the role of the sponsor, the role of the people who pay for the RCT is important. So you need to look for the payers. And I'm going to be rude here. I think you need to look for scientists, because scientists want to get an answer, irrespective of the answer, and they're not here to promote a product. And therefore, you need to make sure that these people are not likely to be influenced. And some scientists are really not subject to influence. And then to answer François Bompard, François, some journals, when you send them an article, ask for everything, the protocol, the database, and everything. It's not so unheard of. And if you table your dossier before the regulatory agency, well, they demand all these things. So it's not so, rare. I was referring to the clinical study report, which is what is really at stake here, because there was a movement or some reactions across Europe asking for the EMEA disclose the clinical report on drugs. It's not the case for now, but this is the clinical study report is something which is much closer to the real data for patients. And if you manage to get your to lay your hands on clinical study report, is something if the pharmaceutical industry then realizes that these clinical study reports are going to be out there in the open, well, they're going to be much more cautious. Now, of course, being able to comb through clinical study reports is not something that can be done by just anyone, but there are a number of teams who can do so across the world. And if you take Cochrane, for instance, which is the main source of meta-analysis worldwide, in the Cochrane collaboration, there are some teams that are specialized in access to clinical study reports, and they check and they highlight through this verification some discrepancies, if there are any. Now, with the current system of science and the way scientists are promoted, well, it means that they are paid by someone and they work for some organization, but some places are nicer for scientists, more comfortable, more prestigious, better paid. So of course, these people are just human, and they try to, even if they are really interested in the subject, they try to be recognized for what they do, and they try to get promoted. And they want to get more means to be able to work on what they want to do. And of course, these are conflicting interests. So there's the basic scientific interest, and however, they have to live in the system, and in their scientific environments, they must publish if they want to survive. There's one university that decided to say, well, just give me the 7 best articles. I don't want a long list. In this university, they decided to just ask for the 7 best papers ever published by a scientist, by an academic, before they hire them. And that would be very wise to extend this to all scientists, because there's so much waste in medical research and clinical research in particular. It's unbelievable. You're just seeing the tip of the iceberg with HCQ trials, with the chloroquine trials in France. But if science was more open and more collaborative, we would save money. There would be other problems, obviously, maybe. However, it would be a way to do away with useless research. Or if you were to ask scientists only for their 10 best papers, well, I think it would solve part of the problem. I want to add, says Rony, that medicine and health isn't an exception to the rule. The rule is overarching. If you talk to scientists in other fields, well, they tell you that 90% of these articles are without any interest whatsoever, pointless. There's another question from Natalie. How can you reinforce transparency requirements and access to data to enable truthful and thorough analysis? Well, it's getting access to clinical study reports. once the FDA or the EMEA open or the clinical study reports, there'll be some sound competition and fair competition now following COVID and EMEA moving from to its new headquarters. Well, obviously transparency isn't top of the agenda these days. However, they promised, EMEA promised that it's in the pipeline. It's going to happen one day. Are there any further questions? Well, if not, we're going to leave it there. I'm, of course, not able to give you any conclusion. However, coming back to my first question, can you believe clinical trials? Now, of course, this is a very complex issue. However, in a nutshell, I'd say that the conclusion is that you must keep a critical eye. Right, so we're going to leave it there with two final comments from me, if I may. One concerning doctors, which applies to doctors of my generation in particular, those guys who studied in the 60s or 70s, but to a certain extent, this comment may apply to younger doctors. I have to say that all of us are quite unaware of the pharmacology and we were not very well versed in pharmacology, and though only doctors can prescribe drugs. However, on the whole, I'd say that doctors don't really know what much about the sort of drugs they use. In medical schools, now you get a bit more pharmacology. Of course, you don't want doctors to become pharmacologists, but at least they should know more about the nitty-gritty of these drugs they prescribe. And finally, a second comment on a totally different front. You know that well, WHO is an organization that is important for our work. And I was referring to the study carried out by BMJ on the H1N1 influenza epidemic. And this study from BMJ revealed that there are so many conflicts of interest at all levels of WHO. Financial conflicts in particular, and the problems of pre-qualifications, the vaccine against the rotavirus, Rotazil in particular, I was referring to it earlier on, gave rise to a major push from Gavi and another vaccine approved by Gavi was replaced, was the replacement because Gavi had a preference for this other vaccine manufactured by Merck, if I'm not mistaken. And WHO adopted it. So it goes a long way to highlight how much WHO is, in part, in the hands of big pharma, and not only big pharma, in the hands of the chemical industry as well. And so it's subject to a lot of influence and a lot of influences. To what extent can we believe in what WHO tells us? But it would be the subject of another conference, obviously. Now, thank you very much to all of you who attended this conference tonight, and to all of you who listened up. And thank you again. Have a nice evening. And the next one will be in November. The interpreters thank the speakers. Thank you.